Our two speakers tonight exemplify scholarship, research, and practice, combining their extraordinary skills in the service of real-world issues, such as the scourge of gun violence, including the violence perpetrated upon citizens by those whose job should be to protect them. Their proposed solutions include a clear-eyed look at the pressures that come to bear on varied actors in these situations, and a deep understanding of systemic racism, along with nuts and bolts ideas honed from years of evaluation research. Dr. Joseph B. Richardson, Jr. is the Joel and Kim Feller Professor of African American Studies and Medical Anthropology. He holds a joint appointment in the Departments of African American Studies and Anthropology at the University of Maryland, College Park, and a secondary appointment as professor in the Department of Epidemiology and Public Health, Division of Preventive Medicine at the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He is the principal investigator for the Center for Injury Prevention and Policy at the University of Maryland's Shock Trauma Center, where he investigates violence, trauma, and the effectiveness of hospital violence intervention programs. Dr. Richardson's research focuses on four critical areas: the intersection of structural and interpersonal violence among Black boys and young Black men, the intersection of the healthcare and criminal justice systems as social determinants of health for violently injured young Black men, violence prevention and intervention programming, and parenting and youth strategies for negotiating the social context of violence among low-income Black boys and young Black men. Dr. Richardson is the co-founder and former co-director of the Capital Region Violence Intervention Program at the University of Maryland, Prince George's Hospital Center. He is currently executive director of the Transformative Research and Applied Violence Intervention Lab at the University of Maryland's College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. He is an advisory member for the Maryland Violence Intervention Program, Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, and an advisory board member for the DC Office of the Chief Medical Examiner. He's also the executive producer of the digital storytelling project titled Life After the Gunshot, funded by the Center for Victim Research, Researcher to Practitioner Fellowship. Dr. Rashawn Ray is a David M. Rubenstein Fellow at the Brookings Institution. He is also a professor of sociology and executive director of the Lab for Applied Social Science Research at the University of Maryland, College Park. He is one of the co-editors of Contexts magazine, Sociology for the Public. Formerly, Ray was a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health Policy Research Scholar at the University of California, Berkeley, and he currently serves on the National Advisory Committee for the RWJF Health Policy Research Scholars Program. Ray's research addresses the mechanisms that manufacture and maintain racial and social inequality, with a particular focus on police-civilian relations and men's treatment of women. His work also speaks to ways that inequality may be attenuated through racial uplift activism and social policy. Ray has published over 50 books, articles, and book chapters, and 15 op-eds. His articles have appeared in such scholarly journals as the American Journal of Sociology, Science Advances, and many others. And he's also written for the New York Times, The Guardian, Huffington Post. He's appeared with NBC News, Public Radio International, and many other outlets. Ray has also served on the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington Planning Committee and the Commission on Racial Justice, with Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity. So I want to thank you for helping me to welcome our two speakers tonight.
Thank you all again for the invitation. I really, really appreciate it. And it is always great to be with my University of Maryland colleague, Dr. Joseph Richardson, who is currently running the Department of African American Studies as the interim chair. So it's always great. I think we make a decent tag team. We've done a lot of things together, and hopefully some of that will come out during the Q&A with the work that we've been trying to do in Maryland and throughout the area. So I'm going to primarily talk about Defund the Police and an article that I wrote at Brookings about Defund the Police. I think one big thing to first note is to look at justifiable homicides by law enforcement. Now, when you look at this graphic, one thing that's important to note is that in any given year, well over 1,000 police officers, or well over 1,000 people are killed by police officers. And this is just the data that becomes curated. There are a lot of people who think that it's actually more. We just oftentimes don't have the proper data. But justifiable homicides is a unique thing. It is the number of times that a police officer kills someone and it's ruled as justifiable. So I want you all to think about this. Only about half of the times that police officers kill is it ruled as justifiable. We have to ask ourselves what happens to the other half. And then why is it that well over 90% of officers never face any sort of civil or criminal liability and culpability for the sort of things that they do? One main argument for the rise in justifiable homicides is that it some kind of way corresponds to violent crime, and that's not true at all. What you actually see is that violent crime overall has been plummeting. I mean, even outside of a couple of years more recently, and of course that kind of happens during social movements and other things, we've seen a slight uptick. But overall, I mean, violent crime is still really, really low. I mean, it's at like 1960 levels before we started to have a huge uptick in violent crime. But this is the kicker when it comes to police. What this graphic shows, and this is from FBI data, and these numbers are pretty much still consistent to this day. This is just one of the main graphics that has been put together to kind of highlight the disproportional ways that Black people are impacted by police violence. Bottom line here is that Black people are 3.5 times more likely than whites to be killed by police when they're attacking or when they have a weapon. And so this becomes the kicker. So when people talk about, well, what are we really talking about? When people say Black Lives Matter, what do they really mean? This graphic really captures it. But it should also be clear that no matter if a person did any sorts of other crimes, particularly overwhelmingly nonviolent crimes, that doesn't justify the type of use of force and the police killings that we see more broadly in our country. And to be specific about it, every 40 hours in the United States, that's less than 2 days, every 40 hours a Black person is killed by police. Now, of course, we know that there are trickle-down effects as well. This was a study done in New York City looking at stop and frisk. You can see that this was out of nearly 700,000 police stops. This is the percentage of time that, or the race of the people that were stopped. Half of the time they were Black, a third Latino, less than 10% white. Over 50% of the stops involved frisking, but only 2% of all stops led to the discovery of contraband. And in only about 6% of the times did it lead to a summons, and only 6% resulted in arrest, mostly due to resisting arrest. About 90% of the time, these stops led to nothing. But this is where the problem comes in. This is the number of times that force was used. And you can see the disproportionate ways that force is used on Blacks and Latinos, and then of course followed by whites. This is the reason why stop and frisk was ruled as unconstitutional in the state of New York. That it was very clear that police stops and profiling wasn't about actually capturing crime as much as it was aiming to terrorize entire communities of people. Some of the work that we've done at the Lab for Applied Social Science Research includes conducting implicit bias trainings with police officers. And I'll show you all our virtual reality program and what this work I'm showing you now led to the work that we're doing at the present time. But we had police officers take implicit association tests. And if you all know anything about implicit association tests, hopefully you've taken them before. You can search Harvard and IAT in your search engine, and it'll take you to a website based out of Harvard that is also verified and validated by the American Psychological Association. And these are tests that you take to tell you whether or not you have biases or not. And we give police officers these tests. And one of the tests we give them is this test you're seeing here, is whether or not people have a preference for blacks with weapons or whites with weapons. Now, in the ideal world, we want people to be here. We don't want people to have any preference at all. And what you're looking at, these are from police recruits who are now overwhelmingly police officers, a diverse group of police officers across race, gender, and even age and location, where they're from, rural versus urban. What you're seeing here is not a mistake. That when we had officers conduct this or take this test, overwhelmingly, they had preferences, strong or moderate preferences for blacks with weapons. And none of the officers had strong or moderate preferences for whites with weapons, despite the fact that on average, whites are more likely to own guns and use guns, just generally in the United States, based on the Second Amendment. So we can see the way that bias seeps into the decision-making that officers have. We can see how something that would happen to Jacob Blake can actually happen. We can see what happened to 12-year-old Tamir Rice can actually happen. Philando Castile. I mean, the list could go on and on. Corinne Gaines in Baltimore, which is one of the most tragic incidents. So, of course, there's been a lot of discussion about defunding the police. What is defunding the police? Well, defunding the police really means reallocating or redirecting funds away from police departments to other government agencies funded by the local municipality. Now, there are definitely some activists who feel that defund the police is about abolishing the police. Most people put those into two different camps, that abolishing the police is a thing, that some people want to see the end to the carceral state. But then there are also levels to it. There are other people who want to see policing in its current form abolished and reimagined. So you're starting to kind of hear these terms that can mean similar things, but one is a bit more palatable than the other. So reimagining policing will be the way that I might think about digging up the rotten trees of law enforcement. As I always talk about they talk about bad apples in law enforcement, where those bad apples have to come from somewhere. And oftentimes they come from rotten trees. So you have to dig up the roots. If you know anything about planting and trees, you know then that the roots of trees are 2 to 3 times as deep and strong and wide as the trees that we see above ground. So if you're going to dig those up, you really have to do a lot, because you can't just cut it off, right? It's going to eventually grow back. And so part of chopping down the trees is dealing with the rotten roots of law enforcement. And we have to be very realistic that historically, law enforcement originated from slave patrols. As Black people were fleeing plantations and fighting for their freedom and those sort of things, despite what we've heard historically that didn't happen, that slave patrols will go out and try to catch them. And we also had to be very realistic that overwhelmingly, while these were white men, there were also some Black people that they would recruit to help as well. And so that's why it's important to recognize that the racial composition of police officers on the street doesn't necessarily always do a whole lot in terms of changing the outcomes that we see. And what I found in my work is that defund the police highlights fiscal responsibility, advocates for a market-driven approach to taxpayer money, and has some potential benefits that will reduce police violence and crime. There are 3 main things I want to highlight. First, calls for service. 9 out of 10 calls for service are nonviolent calls. Despite what we might see on TV, 90% of the time, over 90% of the time when police officers are called, nothing violent happens at all. We have to ask ourselves why then there's so much violence that tends to happen during these incidents, and why they're disproportionate in regards to race. The second thing is that the homicide clearance rate is abhorrent. About 40% of murders go unsolved every single year, 2/3 of rapes, 70% of robberies, and about 50% of aggravated assaults go uncleared every single year. I tend to think that if police officers weren't doing everything from trying to think about whether or not there's a pothole in the street to dealing with other sorts of minor types of calls and infractions, that they could actually focus on the more violent crimes among us, which no matter what community people are living in, people want to see those crimes solved. And oftentimes, not only, and I'm pretty sure Dr. Richardson will talk about this, not only are these crimes not solved, but disproportionately are these crimes not solved in Black and brown communities. And people in those communities want to be protected. They want to have police officers protect and serve. And oftentimes that's not what's happening. If we really want to decrease crime, then what we actually have to do is invest in education and work infrastructure. And that is something that oftentimes doesn't happen. We could compare three cities, or three areas, including Montgomery County, Maryland. And you can look at calls for service. This shows you overwhelmingly what people are responding to. Violent crime, less than 5%. Proactive means where they might be serving a search warrant, something like that, even a no-knock warrant, which that is becoming hopefully illegal to do. And then there's a large segment that deals with traffic. So Montgomery County right now, similar to Berkeley, California, they are aiming to outsource their traffic violations and not have law enforcement deal with those sort of things. Property crimes, okay, that makes sense for police to be responding at that point because could still be something going on. But overall, you see overwhelmingly what police officers are responding to, and we have to ask ourselves why we might have so many police officers and why so much force is used. The other thing we know is that response times are off. People living in Black and Latino neighborhoods wait longer for a police officer to be dispatched after an emergency 911 call. So see, people get confused. Like when Black people oftentimes say, yeah, we want more police in our community, what they are essentially saying is that we want the same quality of policing that people in predominantly white neighborhoods get. We want the same quality of responses instead of waiting several minutes for someone to show up to care for one of our loved ones, because we know that those minutes can matter and oftentimes lead to someone's premature death. When we look at police spending, this was in 2015, this just gives you an idea of where the money comes from. About 70% from local, 20% federal, 11% across the state. Everyone is sharing in this, and overwhelmingly it's taxpayer money, but this is the big kicker. Federal spending in law enforcement has increased 350% since the early 1980s. People always highlight the 1994 crime bill, and that should definitely be highlighted, and I've written about that. But the 1986 drug bill that actually led to the widest disparities between crack and cocaine, between crack and powder cocaine, is what we should also focus on. That bill instituted where you could have 500 grams of cocaine, and it's equivalent to the penalty of 1 gram of crack. And that was all about race and urbanicity and income and the places where people were more likely to be doing that. Government spending on police is astronomical, over $140 billion in 2015 alone. And then when we look at how much money is spent, when we look at these different cities, we see that overwhelmingly, a lot of major cities are spending about every $1 out of $3 on law enforcement. In certain places, it's even more. When we look at places like Chicago and Oakland, every $4 out of $10 in Oakland is being spent on law enforcement. Imagine if that 40% went down to 30%. Imagine what that extra 10% would do. And why is that the case? Well, if we look at Oakland, look at what they're spending on other things. Parks and recreation, and Oakland has some nice parks. I lived there when I was working in Berkeley with the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. I mean, very, very nice parks, but not a huge investment. Human services, 1% of the budget. Economic and workforce development for people to get jobs, less than 1% of the budget. Departmental Head Start subsidies to try to invest in early childhood education, less than 1%. Public works, less than 1%. And then of course you have education and you have, healthcare and those sort of things, but these social services are not being funded. When we look within police departments, this is Dallas, you can look at how much training gets compared to just putting officers on the street, compared to criminal investigations, how little community outreach gets, how little department support gets, how little police intelligence. These are the people that are mostly aiming to solve violent crimes. And look at how little funding they actually get. So we have to ask ourselves, why are police officers really on the street if they're not necessarily doing these things? Then we got to ask ourselves, what are all these administrative services? And why are we spending so much money on this? This is over $515 million in one city alone spent on police. We also know that when it comes to civilian payouts for police misconduct, that there's tons of money being spent out on this. I mean, we can look at a series of incidents, and this is what people need to know, that these money comes from taxpayers' money. So eventually, George Floyd, Jacob Blake, Breonna Taylor, their families are going to receive large civil payouts. And those monies come from taxpayer money. It doesn't even come from the budget that I just showed you. These payouts come directly from general funds on top of the budgets that I just showed you. And in cities like Chicago, they spent over $650 million over the past 2 decades in civilian payouts for police misconduct. Imagine if that money went to the west and south sides of Chicago. In New York City alone, in 1 year, they spent nearly $100 million in civil payouts for police misconduct. Imagine if that money went to the Bronx, went to Harlem, went to Brooklyn to invest in schools, to invest in a work infrastructure. Part of what I think is that we need to think about reallocating and also reinvesting in communities, which is one of the things that Congresswoman Bassett said. But we also need to think about shifting funding within police budgets to do other things. We have a virtual reality program in the Lab for Applied Social Science Research where we take police officers through an advanced virtual reality program to help them improve their decision making. I mean, we can measure everything from their heart rate, their stress through speech, their body movement, their weapon tracking, and the like. And then the next thing we need to do is ensure that police officers get mental health training. About 80% of police officers suffer from chronic stress, reoccurring memories, family problems, easily angered, sleep problems. About 1 in 6 are suicidal and 1 in 6 report substance abuse problems. But 90% of them never seek out help or get therapy. So I think we have to think in complicated ways. My research and the interviews I've done with police officers suggest, yeah, it's definitely about reallocating, but it's also about shifting funding within police department budgets to get the type of outcomes that we want. So I'll stop there and turn it over to Dr. Richardson.
Thank you, Rashawn. Good evening, everyone. And I think Rashawn set me up with the alley-oop. So I'm going to try to follow Rashawn's lead. I have several slides, so I just want to make people aware of that. But I'm going to start off with maybe 15 slides, and then I'm going to skip to the programs, which I think will dovetail very well on why the argument has been made for defunding the police and what's the state of violence intervention and prevention funding programs, specifically in the District of Columbia, since this group is called Washington Association of Professional Anthropologists. So I'll leave it right there. Can everyone see that? Great. So I want to start off by saying I'm currently, and I know my RA is on here, will call. I'm currently writing a paper for the Arnold Foundation, and they've asked me to write on non-law enforcement approaches to gun violence. And the way that I typically like to begin any presentation on gun violence is to actually get a temperature on what is violence, right? Because we typically think of violence in terms of fist, stick, knife, and gun. But you will see as I walk you through this presentation that there are many other ways that we can think about gun violence in terms of how we begin to include other definitions of gun violence in our daily language. So when you think about gun violence, you think about in terms of all of these adjectives and names of gun violence here, right? Bullet, killing, a pistol, death. These are the typical definitions that we think about, that Americans think about when gun violence comes to mind. And just to give you a few stats, 31,000 people die from gun violence every year. It's actually a little bit higher than that. 100,000 people in this country are murdered, are shot, non-fatally shot by guns every year. And almost 13,000 people are involved in gun violence and die by gun violence via homicide. The other 2/3 would be suicides, and those are typically overrepresented by whites, while gun violence by homicide is overrepresented, typically 50%, by African Americans. So what does gun violence cost Americans every year? Cost the average taxpayer for a single homicide, $400,000, but that can also get up to $1 million. The number of gun homicides a day in this country is 32, and more than half of all firearm deaths in this country occur in urban areas. And just to put it in perspective, as you can see by the left graph, the United States is almost twice the next country in gun homicides per 100,000 residents, and Black Americans are 10 times more likely to die at the hands of a gun than their white counterparts. And this is what gun violence looks like in the District of Columbia for African Americans compared to other racial groups. I'll just go back to show you that. But I think this graph is very telling because it's it explains what I'm about to dive into. So you can see by the top two lines, the firearm deaths and injuries from March to May 2019 to 2020. And as you can see, the number of gun deaths, which is the solid blue line, or gun injuries, which is a solid blue line, is going up compared to where we were in 2019 around the same time. And so people will ask, well, why is that happening during the COVID crisis? Why have we seen such an increase in gun violence during the COVID crisis? Well, there are plenty of reasons why we would see. One, the number of people who are unemployed, but also what we need to discuss as well is the number of people who have bought guns prior to the COVID crisis, right? And so according to FBI data, in March 2020, there was an all-time record set for background checks. From March to May 2020, the FBI received 9.7 million background check requests compared to 7.3 million a year before. And this led to almost 6 million guns being sold in the United States from March to May 2020, an 80% increase from the last year. Just put that into context. That's almost every single person in the DC metropolitan area buying a gun. But when we think about violence, do we think about it in what other ways can we think about violence? Do we think about violence in these terms? This is water from the Flint water crisis. This is also should be seen as a form of violence. In Chicago, in Inglewood, a neighborhood notoriously which has a reputation for high rates of gun violence, and Donald Trump has actually invoked Inglewood in some of his speeches in terms of sending in the National Guard into those neighborhoods, which I definitely do not agree with. But if you think about the life expectancy in terms of the neighborhood of Inglewood, which is predominantly Black, and Streeterville, which is 8 miles away, which is predominantly white, the difference in the life expectancy gap is 30 years. That should be quite disturbing for all Americans in terms of how we define structural violence, which is preventable harm and avoidable deaths. And a lot of that is linked to the social determinants of health in those neighborhoods. In Washington, D.C., where we live, as you can see, there's a difference between Northwestern DC, for whites who live in Woodley Park, which is predominantly white, has a life expectancy of almost 90 years, compared to 68 years east of the river at St. Elizabeth, which is a 21, 22-year difference in life expectancy in those two neighborhoods, based on zip code. So where you live is predictive of whether you will live a long and healthy, enjoyable life, or you will die from early mortality. Wealth. How does structural racism and structural violence play into in terms of wealth? as you can see here, in the District of Columbia, the average net worth of a white household is $284,000 compared to $3,500 for a Black family. This was done by Dr. Ray and our colleague Sandy Darity, which found that whites who have dropped out of high school have a greater degree of wealth than Blacks with a college degree. And if you think about in terms of access to food and food deserts, as you can see again, the overlap in east of the river, where you will find in the burgundy or maroon, a high concentration of food deserts east of the river. And then as you move further northwest, where the neighborhoods become predominantly white, those are walk-shed neighborhoods where there's easy accessibility to food, grocery stores, as well as transportation. Dr. Ray alluded to this in terms of New York City, but I will put it in the context of Washington, D.C., in a stop and frisk. On average, 45 people are search and frisk every day here in the nation's capital, compared to just 2 white people, despite the fact that whites and Blacks are roughly 40%, 6% of the city's population equally. What does it look like for our children in schools in Washington, D.C.? Black students are 15 times more likely than white students to be suspended. And students are suspended and expelled for discretionary violations nearly 3 times more likely to be in contact with the juvenile justice system. So as you can see, the overrepresentation of Black students in as far as school suspensions and being pushed into the juvenile justice system represent the school to prison pipeline. Black boys experience more downward social mobility. And so if you look at the top, these are all Black and white boys who were born, who grew up rich, but as they got older, far more white children stayed in the upper and middle class, and far more Black boys ended up poor as adults. Arrest for marijuana consumption. And I want you to note, on January 15th, DC legalized marijuana. But as you can see, despite the equal level of Blacks and whites as far as the population in the District of Columbia, you can see the disproportionality in the number of arrests. That's after legalization, which ultimately results in the District of Columbia almost having twice the incarceration rate of the United States, the average incarceration rate in the United States. One would wonder why that would happen. Well, I think Dr. Ray explained that very clearly, and I've tried to articulate it, but you also have to take into context that if you look on the DC Metropolitan Police website, you will find that there are roughly 32 law enforcement agencies that police the District of Columbia. It's been written about plenty of times that the District of Columbia is a police state. It's probably the most police district in the United States. And then ultimately, in terms of other social determinants of health, the fatality rate among Blacks in DC during this crisis that we're currently in right now is 6 times the white COVID fatality rate. And as you can see, that changes as you move further into predominantly white and wealthy neighborhoods in the district. These represent the work that I do. These are gun violence, these are homicides in the DC metropolitan area. And as you can see, they're primarily east of the river and concentrated in Ward 5, which is in the center of Washington, DC, and then in the surrounding jurisdictions, primarily in Prince George's County. These are the disproportionate numbers of shot spots recorded by shock spotter instruments in the District of Columbia. And as you can see, those highlighted in red have the highest rates of recorded gunshots. and this was taken today. In comparison to last year, as you will see, there are 131 homicides currently in DC compared to 114 last year. It's a 15% increase. But what I do want to point out is that if you look at assault with a dangerous weapon, it's relatively the same. And this kind of gets in, this also gets into, as I talk later about the alternatives to policing in violence interruption and prevention models, particularly in the cure violence model, which is here in DC, which has been evaluated in terms of its effectiveness, we'll find that the effectiveness of those programs are often sketchy. So a violence interruption program where they send out credible messages in communities to diffuse violence, often we will find that in some communities, homicides will go down, but assault with a dangerous weapon will go up, and then vice versa. And so I want everyone to think in terms of how can we think of violence in ways that are different from the way that we typically think about violence. We have to move beyond the perception that violence is about guns, knives, batons, and fists, but really look at the way that the systems, the political, legal, economic, healthcare system, all engage in forms of violence to lead to the shorter life expectancies among specific populations, particularly in the District of Columbia. I'll stop right there and we could go into Q&A briefly, and then I'll continue with my presentation in order to let Dr. Ray and I talk before he has to get off of the call.
Wow, thank you. So with 34 people, I'll give you a couple of options. One is you can put your questions in the chat and I will read them. And we have one already. You can raise your hand as a participant. Also, you could unmute yourself and ask a question, and I'll just interrupt if I notice a backup of people using electronic means and bring those up. So to kick it off, we have a question for Dr. Ray regarding the financial breakdown he provided. Is there a more in-depth breakdown of that top category of spending, which I believe that was police on patrol? I'm curious, this is from Matt Stoffer. I'm curious what's all inside the category. For example, does that also include the military style equipment that's being employed by some police departments? And if I got that wrong, Matt, you can go ahead and interrupt. But in the meantime, Dr. Ray, you wanna?
Yeah, so essentially this is a couple things to note. That the top category about patrol is typically officers who are on the street. When it comes to military, so in other words, these are patrol officers. When it comes to military spending, a lot of that money is part of the federal spending that I highlighted, where there's a growing percentage coming from the federal government. So part of what that means is that federal spending money is coming from programs like what's called COPS program that is really funded a lot of police officers being in the street. There are also like the burn grants where they're able to end up applying for federal grants to get military equipment. So oftentimes the money for military equipment comes above and beyond, comes above and beyond what we actually see from the budget that I just showed you. And that's one of the reasons when people talk about demilitarizing the police, they're oftentimes talking about federal money, which is why they direct it to that level. At the local level, oftentimes they might be talking about defunding, and also the military stuff is wrapped up in that, but reallocating at a local level. So part of that top number about patrol officers, where a lot of people say is, well, why do we have so many police officers on the street? And honestly, right now, they're not even on the streets. They're really in cars. I mean, we don't necessarily have law enforcement walking the streets like they used to previously. They're in the cars with a lot of equipment. riding around doing different things. But I mean, that's the extent that I want to say about that. I mean, I know Joe has a perspective on this as well about how we think about military equipment and particularly how we think about the role, the broader carceral state, and how we think about the criminal justice system, particularly private prisons, and how we think about the money that's wrapped up in locking up, and particularly Black people.
No, I would wholeheartedly agree with everything that you've said, Rashawn. And one of the points that I would like to make in terms of what we found in our research with trauma recidivism, and that's multiple hospitalizations. When someone comes into the trauma unit, if they've been injured, we may see the same person come back to the trauma unit, let's say a year later for a similar injury. Now, some people would wonder, well, why is someone coming back to the trauma unit 3 times consecutively for gunshot wounds? Is there something dysfunctional about that person? But really, and it gets to my argument in terms of structural violence, what we found is that the most significant risk factor for bringing someone back to the hospital was if they've been incarcerated for 12 months or more. And now we know that based on felony disenfranchisement and the collateral consequences of felony disenfranchisement, there is the inability to penetrate the legal labor market. If you have a drug felony, which Dr. Ray mentioned in terms of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, the 1994 crime bill, which also prevented people who have drug felonies from living in public housing. So neither can you live in public housing, nor can you live with someone who is living in public housing. You are unable to get food stamps. You are unable to get a Pell loan. So what essentially happens in that situation is you're reduced to second-class citizenship, despite the fact that you may have completed your sentence. And so with the inability to have shelter, access to food, access to an education, ultimately many people resort back to economic crimes for survival, which then leads them to grab a gun, to protect themselves, which ultimately we know the risk of being injured if you are carrying a gun increases the likelihood that you'll either be injured non-fatally or you will suffer from early violent mortality. And so the criminal justice system and all of my work intersects the healthcare system. There's no way of getting around that in terms of structural violence. And those are the things that we really need to pay attention to in terms of gun violence and how we arrived at this place, because we can't look at gun violence in a vacuum. We have to take into consideration that there are all kinds of forms of violence that precipitate gun violence. And until we begin to look at violence more holistically, then we'll just be reduced to the statistics and plotting people on a map without giving them true humanity in terms of how they've managed to navigate the structural violence, which often leads to their early mortality.
I actually have a couple of questions, but I wonder if, Dr. Richardson, you're going to be addressing this in the second part of your talk.
Sure.
So I'm thinking of mental health in 2 ways. One is dealing with the mental health of police. I was surprised to discover this past summer that I have 2 friends with sons who are in police departments. And you know, they are quite worried about them. And the other is dealing with, my understanding is that there are so many calls that police go on that really involve a mental health issue. And I just wonder, also, I think Dr. Ray, you could speak to this too, about programmatic changes to having people who can come out to these calls who are mental health professionals, and what, if you have any programmatic, you know, if you can speak of any programs where this is being done and how well they're working.
Joe, you want to go first, or you want me to?
Oh, you can jump in.
So So I think there are a couple things to think about on the point about mental health. As large as the disparities are in regards to race and police violence, the disparities are actually wider when it comes to people who have mental health problems. And a large percentage of the Black people who police officers end up harassing, brutalizing, and killing oftentimes have a mental health problem. A really good example of that would be Leonard Shand, which happened in Hyattsville last year, where there were so many bullets that were shot up from 10 officers across 3 different departments that students who were filming it in an apartment complex nearby from University of Maryland and Howard University were taking cover because bullets were just flying all around as police officers were just being lackadaisical. So part of what people have recommended, and we can also think about McLean, who was in Aurora, Colorado, who was killed. He was autistic. And then, of course, even recently with what happened in Rochester, New York. So there are a lot of different examples that we could highlight. What people are saying is a couple of things. First big thing is that police officers are not trained or equipped to be able to respond to people who have mental health conditions. They're not even really trained to communicate and de-escalate. Police officers get about 50 hours of firearm training when they come through the police academy. They receive less than 10 hours of de-escalation training. So when they pull a gun on people, we actually shouldn't be surprised about that. That's what they've been trained to do. That's what I've realized the longer I've been studying policing, is that people will send me something and they'll say, oh my gosh, can you look at this? And I'm like, I don't even know why we keep being surprised at this. This is what they are trained to do. And so that's one part of it. The other part of it is that what people want with defunding the police, one big recommendation is to move some of those calls for service away from the police department, so that then you have mental health specialists and addiction specialists who are trained at being able to talk to people and communicate with people when they're having some type of psychological break, where they might have overdosed on drugs or where they have a developmental disability, and you need a special skill set to be able to communicate with them. And there is a sizable percentage of calls for service that could be reallocated. Now, for some people, they might think, oh, that doesn't mean that law enforcement doesn't back up the other people in case something happens. But overall, the first people who are the point of contact needs to happen. There are others who also say that we change the number that's called, right? So it's not just about calling 911, it's about calling another number. I mean, I think that could happen. I tend to think that 911, and look, this can happen and it could happen over time, but I tend to think 911 is so ingrained in people's unconscious minds that when they're under stress, they'll default to 911. Another option would be to train dispatch to be able to make that discernment, but oftentimes they are not doing their jobs well, because the other thing that I know is that the information that the dispatchers provide to police officers oftentimes dictates how police officers respond. So I say all that to say, what are some examples of the mental health part? I mean, there are some places like even in Montgomery County, even though it's partly police officers, Montgomery County has one of the best mental health response units that I've seen. We've had them come through our lab. The way that there's this one group of officers, how they instantly can identify a person with a mental health condition, is amazing. The problem though, Montgomery County has like over 1,000 police officers. Having a group of like 4 to 10 officers who can do this well isn't really going to have a huge impact, because it's just a subset of them doing it. There are other examples of as well, even beyond mental health, which is like responding to traffic calls. Berkeley, California is trying to do that. Montgomery County is actually raising it up now. And so, I mean, we are seeing some of those changes starting to happen with calls for service. And I think collectively, with some additional training, as well as dealing with the calls for service, that we can start to see different outcomes with these police calls.
Thanks. Dr. Richardson, did you want to add to that, or?
What I would add, and I'm going to talk a little bit about it in the next part of my presentation, but DC, particularly Kenya McDuffie, who is the council member for Ward 5, has implemented and legislated several bills, particularly the NEAR Act, which is neighborhood engagement achieves results, which has provided significant funding to support violence interruption and prevention workers who are actually trained, and within the trauma units, who are actually trained in emergency mental health first aid. They're trained in cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as motivational interviewing. And so we were able to have more of those individuals who were in the communities that had these kind of skill sets, as well as training residents in the community how to deal with emergency mental health first aid. I think there's an opportunity for us to also engage community residents and training community residents how to deal with mental health issues among their neighbors and their friends, and probably would be more receptive to that informal kind of mental health first aid if it's coming from someone that they know. And so there's been significant investment, at least from the DC government, through the health department and the Office of Health Equity, to train violence interrupters, as well as those individuals that are working in the trauma units all around the Washington, DC metropolitan area in mental health. And I can definitely say, as a former director of a hospital violence intervention program, the key to our success was the cognitive behavioral therapy that we provided for the young men that we worked with. It had a significant impact in not only reducing traumatic stress, but other health risk behaviors that were associated with that traumatic stress. And so it's key that we continue to invest in even non-law enforcement approaches within these communities, where we can support people who are on the ground that are credible, that are actually trained in mental health first aid, as well as trauma-informed care and other forms of cognitive behavioral therapy.
All right, thank you. I don't know when you want to get started again, but we do have another question sitting in the chat from Nazia Hussein. For either of you, how might you approach a policy dialogue with a school district or a city council when discussing defunding versus divesting?
With a city council, so in other words, wanting to ensure that the city, I assume this is about ensuring that that you don't want the school to have a student resource officer. Is that the point?
Nazi, you can, yeah.
Yes, that's correct. There's been a lot of conversation happening around that in Dallas, particularly where I am. And so I wanted to get your perspective on some of this, especially around defunding versus divesting.
Defunding versus divesting. Yeah, so, so divesting, in a sense, still means disinvesting, and it could still mean reallocating funding. I think at times with these terms, we get caught up with the terms, and they almost kind of mean similar things in a sense. Like, I really put them in two broad categories. You have the abolition part, and then you have the reallocation, divest, reinvest. Honestly, I think you use whatever term is palatable for the people you're talking to. And oftentimes it's reallocate. But I think when you're talking about school systems, and even what I've advised cities and counties to do on this, on just the reallocation issue in general, is to take a evidence-based, market-driven approach. So in Dallas, of course, because I was highlighting some of that, you could look at disparities in school suspensions, disparities in use of force and brutality within schools. You can look at disparities in arrest. And then you can look at how much money the Student Resource Officer program is costing the city, and figure out, and normally what the data will show is that it's not a good bang for your buck when it comes to equity or when it comes to being fiscally responsible. Now, the key point though with this, and I always tell people this, when you start talking about divesting, whether that be removing police officers from a school, whether it be a high school or a university, you have to think consciously about what you are replacing it with. You need to have a response for that. And why do I say that? Because even though there's one officer in the school, if you remove that one officer and something happens, 3 or 4 police cars might show up at the school, and that could end up being a worse outcome for students than the previous one. Not saying we want either one. It's not an either or. We want to reimagine and for it to just be better. But right now in people's lexicon is if you remove them, you have to replace it with something. And so part of it then could be one big thing I've heard.
Oh.
Let me tell you the problem there that I've heard. Counselors are like, look, you don't pay me enough money to be getting in the middle of a fight between two high school students where I might lose my license or lose my job because if I lay hands on someone, there's a problem. Whereas if a police officer does it, it's a different outcome. So I'm saying all that to say that I think that the direction that your question, that's the direction we should move. Like we should not have police officers in our schools. I think that's highly problematic. But we have to think about what the replacement becomes, because the policymakers are going to be thinking about, okay, we remove SRO. Now what else do we put in there? But I think an evidence-based approach is the best way to do it, to show that we're spending all this money on this SRO officer program and the outcomes we want are not the outcomes that we're getting. Joe, what do you think?
No, I totally agree. And I think one of the approaches which I just mentioned would be these alternatives to policing, such as a cure violence program. Like, why shouldn't cure violence programs or advanced peace programs that engage in violence intervention and prevention, that actually have credible people who are from the community, that have been trained to diffuse and mediate conflict, as well as engage in informal cognitive behavioral therapy while they're working in the context of the school? There's no reason why we need to have police officers within schools when we have violence interrupters who are actually literally stopping people from shooting each other in our streets and preventing far more homicides and non-fatal shootings by merely using conflict resolution tactics, that we could also utilize that same model within our public school system.
Thanks. So again, tell me when you want to move on, but here's first there's a comment that from Emily that best practice for helping someone right now who's a threat to themselves or others regarding mental health is to tell the 911 operator that the person is not breathing so that fire or medics are sent out before the cops. I don't know if you want to comment on that or if you want me to just go on to the next question.
Was that a question or was it?
It was a comment.
Okay.
And then, Emily also said, as researchers working with police departments, do you believe that these institutions of state violence can actually be reformed? So she's not talking about money, but the ideology of the institutions.
So I think on the first front, you know, Emily, you bring up a good point. It is so sad to have to think that when you need help, that you should have to posture and do all of this stuff to try to get someone to come out and just care for you instead of potentially kill you. And, you know, that's my reaction to the first, to your comment. And obviously I think about Rochester and other places where this has happened. On your second question, do I think that it can be reformed? So I think there are a lot of things that have to line up for policing to do what we want it to do. But this is the interesting thing, though. We see police officers every single day act the way we want them to act. And oftentimes they're in predominantly white middle-class neighborhoods. There are reasons why they don't have these problems. So it's very clear that the same way that they choose to act a particular way, they can also choose not to act a particular way. And at times those are the exact same people, which is why this racial reckoning moment is such an important moment, because white people are finally starting to recognize that, wow, these same police officers that treat me and my kids well are the same cops who can go on the other side of town and potentially kill a black person simply because they behaved exactly like we were behaving. And so I say all that to say that I think that a lot of things have to line up for it to change, but there is one big one we haven't talked about that I'm a big proponent about. part of the reason why police officers act the way they do, and the reason why I just said what I said, is because there is a lack of accountability. When I just talked about the civil payouts for police misconduct, they don't have any liability in that. They don't have any civil liability because of qualified immunity. And then qualified immunity is interpreted to apply to criminal proceedings, even though it's simply about financial liability and financial culpability. So one big change I think should happen is we should shift. So this is about shifting. We should shift money for civilian payouts away from taxpayer money to police department insurance policies. Now, the municipality will still cover the policy, but what will happen at that juncture is just like you have in a car. It's just like you having kids and you having multiple people on your policy. Someone has an accident, your premium goes up. You know what? We use this model with the vehicles we drive. We use it when you go to the hospital. If physicians keep making mistakes, they cost the hospital more money, and eventually the hospital says you can no longer perform surgery here. That can happen in police departments. And now all of a sudden, if that money, if it is specified in legislation that the money comes from the police department budget, because again, not only are these civil payouts going out, but they're not coming from the police department budget. So they have no incentive, no constraint to behave differently when they interact with certain people. And I tend to think that if they had that constraint, we would see a much different outcome. I'll give you a really good example from the University of Maryland. I know Joe has some reactions to this too. University of Maryland Police Department has a history. Prince George's County Police Department has a history. And even some of this is a recent history. And oh yeah, talking about police unions. So I'll rope that into this real quickly and then let Joe respond, is that their students put together a great report recently. I met with them this summer. Some of them, we have like a new community policing task force. Joe, you're on that, right? Or did you decide that? Okay, yeah, so Joe is on this community policing task force. And this one report, students highlighted as something like over the past couple of decades, police officers have pulled their guns like 600 times. It equaled like twice a month or something like that. They've never pulled a trigger. You know why? Because there are real repercussions in that police department on that campus if you pull the trigger. Now, that doesn't mean they're not beating people up. It doesn't mean they're not arresting people. It doesn't mean they're not doing other things. But it's very clear they got a message to not pull your trigger. You can pull your gun, but don't pull your trigger. The thing I learned about police officers is that they follow instructions very, very well. Very, very well. So their instructions have not been stop killing Black people. That's the reason why they're quitting right now. Like in Rochester, the entire department is quitting because they're like, hold on, wait, we actually have to change how we treat Black people. That's essentially what they're saying without saying it. They're saying, oh, shoot, there are actually consequences to hurting Black people now? Where'd that come from? And if you notice, even Black cops are doing it. The Rochester chief of police is Black. Like, we have to get out of this framework that some kind of way these are white officers doing this to Black people. That's not what the research shows. The research shows is police officers trained and socialized a particular way to enact violence on a particular group of people. So the fraternal order of police, of course, plays a role in this because one thing that I think people don't realize is not only do they have contracts that taxpayers and voters need to say we don't want anymore. That's the first big thing. But the second thing is that the fraternal order police president is oftentimes more powerful than the police chief. Because see, the police chief is outward facing. They are appointed by the mayor or the county executive or what have you. The fraternal order police president is voted on by other police officers. This is the reason why in Minneapolis, the police chief doesn't have any pull. Like, I don't care if he's been on TV or whatever. He has no pull whatsoever with those cops. Nothing. And I'll tell you why. About 12 years ago, the police chief in Minneapolis, who you all have been seeing on the news, who seems really progressive, but 12 years ago, he had to sue his own department, the Minneapolis Police Department, for failure to promote. He went on to be over internal affairs when what happened? When Derek Chauvin had the most complaints in his career. That same dude went on to be chief. So when I sit up and I see police chiefs on the news talking a good game, I'm like, you have no power at all. You are not influential with your members at all. So part of it is thinking through, whereas the FOP president has been there for a long time. I mean, this dude is speaking at Trump rallies and stuff. I mean, that kind of lets you know the depth by which the fraternal order of police controls law enforcement in the United States.
I echo everything that you said, and I think we've discussed this numerous times in terms of it's a matter of economics, right? If police could be held civilly accountable for their actions and they could be sued civilly as an individual officer, they probably would not engage in the number of behaviors that they're allowed and permitted to engage in.
Exactly.
If police budgets were affected for the lawsuits and we had to reduce police budgets instead of it coming out of the city's budget but coming directly out of the police budget, that would change the narrative. If we were able to have special prosecutors who were not tied in to the police, and I think that's definitely one of the issues that we see all the time in terms of, and we talk about progressive prosecutors, but we really have to get at what that means. What does a progressive prosecutor really mean? And I'll just give you an example that's really kind of relevant to this in terms of progressive prosecutors and something I found recently. So in the fatality reviews that I sit on the DC Fatality Review Board, and we go over homicide reviews and determine, okay, what happened in this person's life where we could have averted this person's particularly young person's death. And what we have found in terms of the reviews that we've had thus far is that each person that's died from an early violent death, which we've had people under the age of 24, they've had gun charges. But what has happened in terms of what progressive prosecutors think is, well, I won't send this person to jail, but I'll put them on probation or parole or probation. And so what ultimately happens is we hear this narrative of decarceration and the lowering of the number of people that are incarcerated, but we really don't tell the full story that placing somebody on probation really doesn't provide them with the services that led them to carrying a gun in the first place, right? And so I say that to say, yes, we embrace the notion of progressive prosecutors, and we would probably embrace a prosecutor who would say, yes, I don't want to throw this Black kid who's 19 years old who has a gun charge into prison, and rightfully so. That's his first time offense. But that doesn't necessarily qualify one to be a progressive prosecutor. I think ultimately what will come down to is prosecutors that have the political will and to indict and go fully through with the indictment and charging officers at the fullest degree and using all of their resources and wherewithal to do it. But what we lack right now is a political will, particularly in a lot of attorney general's office and prosecutor's office, to carry that out in many cities, which is why we don't see in most situations that officers are convicted for the crimes that they've committed. So because they also know that in a sense that even if they do engage in these crimes, they typically have the support of the prosecutor's office. So I'll end it at that.
Great. Wow. We've got some really big, heavy topic, big picture questions. One about whether it's naive to think in terms of a cultural shift and reforming, if that's what's necessary to reform the system. And oops, I lost. Well, I guess we could start with that. Yeah. We are dealing with a violent, okay, so we're dealing with a violent system. How do you see individuals experiencing a cultural shift, reforming the said system? Is there a pathway for change that is rooted outside the financials? And actually before that, Kyla asked, she said, if these institutions are rooted in racially charged and biased perspectives, is it truly possible to reform the institution, or should we be working towards establishing new institutions? So in that case, is it really enough to defund the police?
I mean, no, and I hope that we're being clear about this. So essentially what we're saying is that one, because I mean, obviously the topic tonight was about defund the police. So that's the perspective that we're coming from. That's one thing that should happen. But part of what we're getting at is definitely not culture. What we're really talking about are structural and systemic changes. I tend to think that if we go, let's just look at history. During the civil rights movement, a large percentage of Americans who were mostly white, but not all, there were some black people and others as well, who thought that the civil rights movement was off base, who overwhelmingly, MLK had a very low approval rating at the time he was assassinated. Most people who oppose Black Lives Matter today would have opposed MLK in the 60s. And part of thinking through that is at the time policy change occurred, people's attitudes were not up to speed. What I find interesting about this moment, and this is what Joe was talking about the political will, we have to ask ourselves what a political will is given the level of public attitudes and support for Black Lives Matter and making changes to policing. So really what we're talking about are structural and systemic changes. And, I don't necessarily I think at times it's difficult for people to grasp the lack of accountability that police officers have to the general public. And as Joe was saying, all of a sudden, if they are held liable financially, now all of a sudden, if they're choosing between pulling the trigger and their pension to send their kids to college, oftentimes they're going to start making a different decision. And so, to Kylie and others' point, is this still about money? I mean, not exactly, but that's a pathway, and I think we have to be very realistic that is a pathway for people that you can force people to treat you a particular way if the financial penalty or the criminal penalty is high enough. So we're not just talking about finances. We're also talking about the criminal penalty, the political will that Joe was talking about from prosecutors to pursue police officers for doing that. I mean, we got to think about, and this is the other thing. So I also see progress in this moment. Maybe it's because I'm so ingrained in this space, but let's go back 5 years ago when Freddie Gray was killed in Baltimore. And I remember Marilyn Mosby stood on those steps and she said, and she charged those officers and everybody cheered. Most of those officers are still back out on the street, terrorizing people. So what did that do? Let's fast forward though to this year. Those 4 officers in Minneapolis were fired almost immediately. They have been charged. Now we have to see if they're going to be convicted. I got a feeling that Chauvin will at least. And they have been charged. They don't have their job. Now we need to make sure they don't have their pension. Wisconsin is one of the only states where they can still get it. These are state laws that we need to have changed. But we look across the country, there are police chiefs who are resigning. In Rochester, their entire senior leadership just resigned. Why is that? Because they understand that they are starting to be held accountable for what they're doing. So I'm saying all that to say, and then let me make a broad point, and then I'll stop, because I love these questions. So I love the questions that people have right now. This is a great conversation. The George Floyd Justice and Policing Act that passed the House of Representatives is one of the most progressive forms of legislation we've had on policing. The problem, though, is that the Senate doesn't want to bring it up. Mitch McConnell isn't going to let it come before them. So what is the pathway at this point? Is it to simply stop at the symbolic passage that happened to happen on Tamir Rice's 18th birthday? No, there are changes that could be made. If Joe Biden was elected and 4 to 6 Senate seats flip, in January, the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act becomes law, and we have a very different policing system in 2021 than we've ever had throughout American history. Now, is that far enough? No, I don't think so. But it is so much farther than what we have right now. And we have the ability in less than 60 days to actually do something about that. So when I think about where we are at this moment, I think we are on the cusp of something great if we're willing to actually do it. And then the political will that Joe was talking about will happen at the federal level, and I think states will follow.
One of the big obstacles to accountability, police, are the police unions. and the police unions seem untouchable. Is that the case, or is there something that can be done to take some of their power away, to sort of bring the unions under control? And I'm a union person, but not in this instance.
Joe, you
You
guys
take that, and I'm going to jump in on
the previous thing.
The previous question.
All I was gonna say about unions is fraternal order of police have contracts with cities and municipalities. As voters and taxpayers, we can vote in people who would dissolve those contracts. So in other words, when we're looking to vote people and we contact our state delegates and our county council people and we talk to them, we should be saying, we don't want to spend money on fraternal order police contracts. And we're not going to vote you in unless that is part of your platform. Like, these are things that can happen. I also think that we can, look, I'm also a big proponent of people running for office themselves to be the change they want to see. I have a grad student now, Amanda Dewey, who's a PhD student in Maryland. She's currently the mayor of Berwyn Heights. She's 29 years old. She said, I'm tired of talking about things. I want to be part of it. And she is literally doing what she has to do, still in a PhD program, being a 29-year-old mayor. I mean, young people are being what we really need to be doing as we get older. So I say all that to say, as much as we want to see those things, if nobody's going to move on it, we should move on it ourselves and make these kind of things happen.
I would say, in terms of the previous question regarding the cultural shift, what really needs to happen is the narrative about what works needs to be pushed more in the media. And so in terms of alternatives to policing, whether it's a cure violence program and you're sending violence interrupters who are credible messengers into the streets to diffuse violence, which I would like to say, at least in one neighborhood in DC and the Washington Highlands, there hasn't been a shooting in over 100 days. Like, that never gets on television. Those stories don't make TV. That doesn't make good television. If it bleeds, it leads. So all the amazing programs that I see, for instance, the program that I ran at PG Trauma, in 16 months, we had 116 participants. And our task was to provide psychosocial services so none of these young men come back, when we had a trauma recidivism rate before the program started of 32%. In 16 months, we had 116 people. Only one person came back to the hospital in that 16-month period. That's less than a 1% trauma recidivism rate. We got picked up by the Huffington Post, which I'm very thankful for, to the journalist Nick Wing. But how often do you hear those stories? And so what I find really, concerning and troubling at the same time, but also an opportunity, is to begin to teach journalists about these programs and to get the word out to programs. And I think everyone on this Zoom call should actually engage with whether local journalists or not, to begin focusing on the programs that actually can serve as alternatives to policing, that are actually can assist in reducing violence in our communities, that A, aren't getting attention, B, are not getting the funding. And for example, recently, Governor Hogan in Maryland vetoed the Maryland Violence Intervention Prevention Fund, which is a $3 million fund, which was intended to fund cure violence programs, hospital violence programs, and as well as community-based violence intervention programs. $3 million. It passed the House, it passed the Senate, went to Hogan, vetoed. But yet you have Baltimore City, which spends, well over $500 million on policing. And so in what ways can we use, and when they did an audit on what they were spending, some of the things, as Dr. Ray mentioned, as Rashawn mentioned, they were spending an exorbitant amount of money on things that really were meaningless. So allowing jurisdictions such as Prince George's County and Baltimore City, and I specifically focus on Baltimore City, which has, one of the highest homicide rates per capita in the nation, and not funding those kind of programs, to me, is a form of structural violence. In the same way that Donald Trump would mention in a press conference recently that he knew about the deadliness of the COVID pandemic, but yet chose to downplay it. Those are forms of violence too. 180,000 people roughly, we could have averted those deaths. In Baltimore, where we're seeing over 300 people die from gun violence every year, those deaths could be avertible. And so I hold it at the hands of not only just the legislators and the governor like Governor Hogan, but also that you have to hold the people to the fire. How are we allowing our tax dollars and the governor to veto a bill of $3 million that could potentially save hundreds of lives? And that's what I mean in regard to political will. It's not just the political will of our legislators, it's the political will of everybody on this call. And the reason why we're just not seeing the traction that we need to see in terms of all the programs that I could have presented to you tonight, and I had a multitude of them, but I think the most critical point that most salient point that I could get across to you is we just don't push what works. And part of the problem is we don't have enough research to push it. I don't know how many of you are aware, but since 1996 through the Dickey Amendment, there's been a prohibition for federal government funding for gun violence research. It's almost a quarter of a decade. How many of our citizens were allowing that to happen for 24 years if they weren't aware of that bill or fighting against it? And so recently you had Kenyon McDuffie, again, who created the NEAR Act, councilman for Ward 5, proposes to the DC government to have the first locally funded through the DC government, a gun violence research center to understand what works and what doesn't work. DC government didn't pass the bill. And so again, it's a level of even when we have legislators who have the political will, I'm not sure that we're getting the word out to the people to understand the seriousness and magnitude of many of these issues. If we don't have gun violence research, we just can't understand what works and what doesn't work. And then we're just throwing money, good money, at maybe particularly bad models. And so I would definitely say that in terms of, and this is the last thing I'll say, I was invited before COVID to talk to a boot camp of journalists. And I was tasked as a scholar to present my work in a way that was palatable enough that they could take our discussion and present that to the jurisdictions the cities where they work across the nation and their news outlets. That didn't happen because of COVID. But I definitely think that there's an opportunity for us to bring more journalists in. And, Rashawn and I are out there pitching, our particular arguments in terms of why this needs to happen. But I just don't think the people are aware that there are plenty of programs on the ground and plenty of people on the ground that are doing amazing things where we could be defunding the police or diverting and allocating those funds to those programs, but we just have no idea what those programs are. Because the word is just not, and it's not their fault. We're just not very concerned right now. We're so enamored with the discussion around what defund the police means. We don't really discuss what it's going to be defunded to when those programs actually exist right now. They're viable options that we could use for that funding, but we're just not doing it.
So, yeah. And I can attest, I have the privilege of listening to phone calls of the Violence Prevention Coalition, and it's heartbreaking that more resources have put into this. And Matt, I think anticipating some of what you were saying, and maybe you can expand on what you just said, what sort of outreach exists for the alternative to policing programs that you've been talking about? Can we force, I don't know how we would force them, but can we force media to take notice and promote them through social media campaigns?
I'm not sure whether we can force them to do it, but I would like to see more mainstream media presenting the alternatives to defunding to the police and where we could divert that money too. And so I think while I appreciate the conversation around defunding the police, but I think there's a part B and C and D to that conversation, which mainstream media has yet to pick up on. But in terms of, the Huffington Post, which has written these articles, and us in this, Rashawn and I in this conversation, getting it out to you, I think it's a kind of imperative, even for you, the people that are on this call, whether you're mass tweeting it out, okay, these are programs that could serve as alternatives to policing. There is a cure violence program. There's an advanced peace program, which was created out of Richmond, California, which basically identified young men who were responsible. They found that almost 3% of the city's population were responsible for the majority of homicides and shootings. Same thing in Chicago, 1% of the population. In Oakland, 1% of the population. So so when you hear the narrative of law and order from Donald Trump, which is basically taken out of the page from the Republicans from the 70s up until now, I mean, that's a narrative that's constantly been pushed. But what people don't really understand is that there's a small percentage of people who actually engage in the majority of crimes. And if we could target that small percentage, not with law enforcement, but with wraparound services, life coaches, mentors, employment that subsidize, we could actually turn the lives of people around. And some of those models have been borrowed now through the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement in DC. They have a Pathways program, which basically targets high-risk young Black men and women and other groups of color that are at great risk within the city, and providing them with wraparound services in the form of subsidized employment, educational opportunities, and also the ability to work with life coaches. But this is the last thing I would add. We also need in our assessment of what works and what doesn't work is to move out of the cookie cutter approaches that we have right now. And so many of the programs that we are pushing in terms of cure violence, and I don't want to take a jab at them, but I would say many well-accepted and well-branded programs are often too big to fail. And so what I see now as the conundrum is that there are violence intervention and prevention programs that have been up for 20, 30 years that are operating on it with the same model that they've been operating on since 1998. And what we really need is to have true evaluation of these programs to determine how we can innovate them to make them much more adaptable and flexible to the times. And so without that level of innovation, without that thinking outside of the box and embracing what we normally would think was impossible as possible, we're going to be stuck in a situation that we are in right now. But I do believe that we have the opportunity to strike right now, and that there are plenty of scholars and researchers and practitioners who have some amazing ideas about what could be done, but we just need to have the funding, the political will behind us to get these things launched.
So we have a good 15 minutes before our president will bid us good night. Are there specific examples that you would like to share with us in that time?
Sure. So
I'm gonna let Joe take over. I'm overdue for the time that I have to pull my daddy duty. So
well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, really.
All right.
Great having you.
I know Joe will close it out. Thank you all for the time.
I will. I'll bring it home for us.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Joe.
All right.
Bye, everyone.
Bye. So I'll just play this from the current slide. So this is the NEAR Act. Guys can look it up. But this act actually created by Councilman McDovey, and which passed in 2016, funds the cure violence model in DC, as well as the hospital-based violence intervention models in the city. So there roughly, these are kind of three things, there's several things that I wanted to go over, but I know we only have 15 minutes. We have the Office of Neighborhood Safety and Engagement, which is the ONE's office, the Office of Violence Prevention and Health Equity, which sponsors the hospital violence intervention programs, the DC Attorney General's office, which funds Cure Violence, which is known in DC as Safe Streets. We have the DC Violence Fatality Review Board. And then we also have the DC Department of Health Fire Injury Surveillance through Emergency Rooms, which is called FASTER. The DC Department of Health recently received a grant from the CDC to track all non-fatal shootings that are treated in the city's trauma centers, to track them in real time and create a dashboard. And then finally, Kenyon McDuffie proposed the Center for Gun Violence Research because, as I mentioned to you, since 1996, there's been no federal funding through the CDC or the NIH for gun violence research. Up until this year, the CDC and NIH provided a $25 million grant. So you just got to put that in scale. Gun violence costs $229 billion a year, and the CDC and NIH collectively, between the two, proposed RFAs for $25 million, splitting $12.5 million between each organization, a drop in the bucket. So this is Advanced Peace, which is the model I mentioned in Richmond, California. And as I said to you, there were less than 30 men in Richmond, which at that time had one of the highest homicide rates in the country, that was responsible for 70% of the city's gun crimes. In other cities, in Chicago, they found that 70% of all non-fatal gunshot wound victims were in the social networks of other co-offending people who are also engaged in non-fatal crimes. That were 6% of the total population. In Minnesota, less than 1% of the population was involved in 54% of the city shootings. And in Oakland, you had 1% of the city's populations that found 400 people were at risk and responsible for the majority of the city's homicides. So I want you to get this notion out of that they're boogeymen that are running around in this law and order narrative, when it's really a small percentage of people who are actually engaging in violent crime. And so I want to move on. I think this would be a great book for everyone to read. It's called Bleeding Out by Thomas App, and the book is about focused deterrence and all the alternatives to law enforcement strategies that are successful, that have been evaluated, that I think it would be great for everyone to read and educate themselves on. So what the Advanced Peace model does is they create a fellowship program, and these are kind of the 7 touch points. Young men and women are referred to their program primarily through the Department of Probation or Parole. Sometimes they are referred by law enforcement, and at other times through hospital violence intervention programs and other community-based organizations, right? And so this is what they provide. So this is the success of the program. So as you can see, they're in their 6th cohort. There are 37 fellows in that cohort. 100% of them are still alive. They've had 6 cohorts of 127 fellows. And as you can see, between 2010 and 2019, 127 of those fellows are still alive. You look at this chart, 16 through the Office of Neighborhood and Safety, 16 firearm incidents were prevented, which was a savings of anywhere between $6 and $15 million. You can see the price tag. One shooting for violent injury costs $435,000, and one gun homicide is $1 million. This is in the city of Richmond. But the Office of Neighborhood and Safety costs $1.2 million to run. So as you can see, the cost differential if you invest in violence prevention and intervention services. On the bottom graph, you can see the reduction in the number of people who were shot in Richmond, 242 at the creation of the program, and now it's down to 37. So as I mentioned, DC modeled their program based on the Richmond, California model. DC also has an Office of Neighborhood and Safety Engagement. They have a Pathways program, which is very similar to the Advanced Peace Fellows program, where they're working with individuals between the ages of 20 and 35. And they also work with CSOSA, which is DC's primarily Department of Probation. And they also work with the hospital violence intervention programs in the DC metropolitan area. So the first phase of their program is 9 weeks of classroom-based training. And then they offer subsidized employment for the next 6 months. They get, I believe, $15 an hour. And then after they finish that 6 months, then they are supposed to transition into long-term unsubsidized employment. The reason why I asterisk that, because one of the things I'm really concerned with, what I've seen happen with the young men that I work with, is that once they transition from subsidized to unsubsidized employment, they are not hired back. And so one of the things I do have a question about is, are these programs being used in terms of corporate welfare? So the government is subsidizing young people to work, and then after that employment period is over, the long-term retention is questionable whether that continues. But we still need to conduct research to determine whether that's happening. Then you have the Cure Violence model, which is started by Gary Slutkin, which is in hundreds of cities around the country as well as internationally. And that model treats gun violence as a disease, and there are violence interrupters that are trained to interrupt the transmission of violence through conflict resolution and spending time with identifying those individuals who are at most risk of engaging in gun violence in those communities. Typically, the violence interrupters are called credible messengers because they are people who have credibility in the community and often may share the same backgrounds with the individuals that they're working with. So participants that are recruited in the Cure Violence must meet at least 4 of the 7 criteria: gang involved, a major player in a drug or street organization, violent criminal history, recent incarceration, a reputation of carrying a gun, and a recent victim of a shooting, and being between the ages of 16 and 25. These are the jurisdictions in DC where these programs are located. And as you can see, even though these are all high-risk wards, they're in specific, what they call beats, and those beats are marked. But one of the things that's quite challenging about these programs is you could have a violence reduction in one of these areas, and then a neighborhood that's adjacent to it that has high rates of violence where there are no violence interrupters. There's no way to, currently with the current model, there's no way to address a violence in the adjacent communities. And so one of the innovative models that we're currently thinking about is making the violence interrupters not just situated in one neighborhood, but actually making them mobile so they can move and respond to hot spots of violence around the city instead of being situated in one neighborhood. And so you can see here, I'll go back, sorry about that. This is in Congress Heights, where where I mentioned that there were over 100 days with no shootings. And you can see on the bottom, the number of gun homicides in 2018, 2019, and then you see 0 in 2020, right? And so that's where one of the violence interrupters cites. But also I wanted to be assault with a deadly weapon. So as you can see, the number of assaults with a deadly weapon are actually higher than the number of gun homicides. And that's one of the difficulties in evaluating these programs, because what you will see is a decrease in homicides, but then you'll also see an increase in the number of non-fatal shootings, right? So it's hard to discern, even though you're reducing the number of people who are killed by firearms, you're still seeing an increase in many of these sites in non-fatal shootings. So again, these programs are very difficult to evaluate, but one of the things that I would emphasize the most is that there's a lack of consistent and financial support to operate these programs. And I just mentioned to you the Maryland Violence Intervention and Prevention Fund, which was not funded by by Governor Hogan. So this was the cover for the article that I conducted for the hospital program, violence intervention program I directed at Prince George's. Hospitals are trying to do what politicians haven't, stop gun violence. So HVIPs, there are roughly 37 around the country that are situated in primarily level 1 and level 2 trauma units. And what we typically do is when someone comes into the hospital, this young, handsome guy on the right, this other young, handsome guy on the left, he's the credible messenger. His name is Che Bullock, and he will approach every single person who has been injured at bedside. He's also a credible messenger. He was stabbed 12 times. And actually, I met him while I was conducting a study at the hospital on violent injury. And out of the 25 people in my study, I decided that I thought he would be the best person to work in the program. So he's part of the success of the 116 people being recruited into the program, but also us having a trauma recidivism rate of less than 1%. And so this is an article, you can pull it up. It's written by my graduate research assistant, Will Call, myself, and Che Bullock on the role of the credible messenger and how that person is involved in the lives of these young men that they approach at bedside, and then they continue that mentoring relationship in the hospital and then after they're discharged. So in the DC metropolitan area, we have Project Change, which is sponsored by the DC Office of Victim Services and Justice Grants. We have 4 hospital violence intervention programs in the DC metropolitan area. And actually, that is the highest number of HVIPs in one metropolitan area in the country besides Philadelphia. Philadelphia has 4 HVIPs and DC has 4 as well. But I'm really pleased and proud of the HVIPs in DC because we started in 2017. Philadelphia started many years ago, and they have 4 hospital violence intervention programs. And so as I mentioned, we had 116 participants, only 1 person was re-injured. And then what we try to do is focus on what's called the golden hour. There's a 72-hour period where we meet that person at bedside where they are. The likelihood that we can get them to consent to join our program, the likelihood of that is higher if we get them while they're in the hospital, because that's when they're more likely thinking about how they can change their lives and the risk that led them to being shot. So hospital violence intervention programs, sorry about that, work. There are not a lot of RCTs, but you can see in one randomized controlled trial, an HVIP lowered the trauma recidivism rate among those who received the services to 5% versus those who did not receive the services to 36%. And then one of our other tasks is also to reduce the criminal recidivism rate. And as you can see, for those who receive services from an HIVP, their conviction rate was 13% versus those who did not receive the services at 55%. And then as you can see, we also provide social services in the form of employment. And you can see the increase from 82% for those participants in the program versus participants who did not engage, which is 20%. But one of the weaknesses of HVIPs is we have a lack of randomized controlled trials, and that's primarily because we don't have enough funding sources to support our work. This is Kenyon McDuffie, who I talk about ad nauseum, and he actually proposed the Center for Firearm Research in DC. Violence Fatality Review Committee for DC, which was recently comprised, and we're the only violence fatality review committee in the country that's under the office of the Chief Officer of the Medical Examiner. So what we do is we assess the nature of homicides and suicides in the district. We go through every single person that's been killed. We go through their social service records, their educational history, their family history to determine where we could have intervened. And as I mentioned, what we are finding is that many the young people that we have reviewed thus far who have been killed, all under the age of 24, that they have been previously charged with a gun charge. And we recently made our first recommendation that the Attorney General for DC should divert all young people who have been adjudicated for a gun charge to community-based programs that can provide intensive psychosocial services. And then finally, we have a lack of timely local level data on ED visits for non-fatal firearm injury. We are not collecting that data in real time. And so what that has led to is FASTER, which is the Firearm Surveillance Through Injury Rooms, which recently the DC Department of Health was awarded. And I'm glad to say that I wrote their recommendation letter. So they will be one of 7 sites around the country that are actually engaging in collecting non-fatal firearm injury data in real time from all the trauma centers in DC. And then finally, community justice centers. So, which is not a new idea. It's a restorative justice approach, which has typically been reserved for offenders and victims and family members, where offenders are brought and held accountable for the harm that they've committed to their victims, as well as family members and communities. But I think that concept of community justice centers could be expanded to holding the systems that are accountable for structural violence. So not only are we going to hold individuals responsible for interpersonal violence, we should also use community justice centers to hold systems accountable for the structural violence that they may have inflicted upon communities that have led to disproportionate rates in life expectancy. And so we can hold the political, legal, educational, and economic systems accountable in the same ways that we would hold individuals accountable with a restorative justice approach. And we can also use them to serve as a space for truth, reconciliation, and reparations designed to address the harm done to Black, Latinx, and Indigenous communities. So finally, sustainability, which is the challenge for all of the programs that I've worked with. How are we managing to sustain these programs? Because the effectiveness often relies on sustainability. And so this year, part of the DC police budget reallocated the funding, some of the funding for the police to violence reduction programs, but also, as I mentioned, the Maryland Violence Intervention Prevention Program Fund was vetoed, $3 million bill by Governor Hogan. So you can see 2 kind of contrasting approaches, one by DC, where they've decided to take some of their police budget and fund violence reduction programs, and then the alternative, contrasting view of vetoing the bills designed to fund violence reduction. And so this is the last thing I would say. Then these are from quotes from the DC Council. Councilman Robert White was a vocal critic of the police, said it would take years to successfully overhaul policing as the city continues to experiment with alternative approaches. It's really only been a few weeks since we've had enough public support to trim police budgets and enough room to try a different path. We have to make sure that the programs we are instituting are working and make sure people don't feel unsafe. And again, this comes back to evaluating what works and what doesn't work. And then Councilmember David Grasso, who has called for the resignation, which recently happened, of DC's police chief, said that the city does not have the political will right now to radically alter its approach. And without the mayor's support, you are not going to see major changes. There are too many people still stuck in the old ways of a law and order kind of approach. And so that is a summary of what works and what doesn't work. I hope you were able to get something out of at least those models. And again, to echo the council members and echo what Rashawn and I have been discussing throughout this conversation, it really comes down to the political will. of the legislators and the people.
Wow, that was fantastic. That was incredible. I mean, I want to thank you and Dr. Ray profusely for this program. And I'll get the final word back to our president.
I just want to thank everyone who's been here, Dr. Richardson, Dr. Ray, and all the participants. And I hope you'll join me in unmuting yourself and giving them a hand, because it's been wonderful, and I really appreciate it. I think we all do. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you again. Also, put some information in the chat, some links that people might be interested in.
Okay.
And you can also follow our project. We have a digital storytelling project titled Life After the Gunshot, which you can find on lifeafterthegunshot.com. We also have a podcast under the same title. And then you can find me on Twitter at DocJorich, Doc Joe Rich on Twitter.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Good
you
night,
for inviting
everybody.
me. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thanks.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Good night, everyone.